For today's video, we're going to be discussing the growth of storytelling when it comes to video games and the concept of marrying game mechanics and loops to the story of the title, and why this is actually a lot harder than it sounds to do right. Over the last 15 years, the game industry has taken major steps to try and elevate and almost legitimize itself among mainstream audiences and storytelling. And a big part of that was trying to get more serious or more grounded with some of the stories it was trying to tell. Whether it was personal stories such as Gone Home, Dear Esther, two titles that have been trying to tell or I guess really go big in terms of emotional payoff, whether it was the father-son dynamic in God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2, and I'm sure we can think of many other examples as well. But with this greater focus on the story and the world of the game, it has presented an ever-increasing challenge for developers. How do you marry an interesting or deeply and touching story with gameplay loops and mechanics, as this is a concept that is pretty much unique to the game industry. And as I said before our little title bump there, this is a lot harder than it sounds. When we look at the old days, the most complicated stories we had were the princess is in another castle, or the president has been kidnapped by ninjas and you have to save them. Today it's gotten a lot more elaborate, as well as with the game mechanics and design. And we can certainly have a fun little game here describing some of our favorite clashes, or as we've said before, the ludonarrative dissonance that has fallen into some of these games. And if you have any of your favorites, let me know in the comments below. Here are some of the ones that come off or right off the top of my head. It is a JRPG world and the bad guy is going to destroy everything in a few days, but we can spend 100 hours doing side quests. Action games where the main character is nigh indestructible and does all these crazy moves during cutscenes, and then you die in 3 hits during the actual game. And there are many, many more examples of this. And when we talk about kind of trying to elevate storytelling and video games, it becomes, I think, very hard for a lot of people to kind of separate this. Because we've seen games, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, that have earned major accolades for a story, despite the fact that it doesn't really fit or just feels kind of weird or not connected to the actual gameplay loop. Undertale in the corner there obviously is one such example. A game that was very praised for its story and breaking RPG conventions and norms. But I just always had this very annoyance, or the whole genocide, pacifist kind of design of the game just didn't really work for me. It's one of those cases where the game calls you out for doing something that you kind of programmed into the game itself. We also saw like a lesser example of this kind of disconnect with the very famous Spec Ops: The Line, which didn't go as far as some of the other examples I want to talk about, but was kind of one of the first games to try and do this marriage. If you didn't play it, as you got further into the game and the main character's PTSD and issues started to take hold, the loading screens began to become corrupted, basically asking you and breaking the fourth wall with certain questions. Now, when we start seeing this kind of combination of storytelling and game mechanics, the problem and why this is so difficult is that video games it's kind of hard to explain this, but there's a lot of, I guess, quote-unquote fat to a game that you don't see or don't have to deal with in any other medium. When we look at movies, TV, books that are describing or having to talk about something complicated or in-depth, they can just kind of do it in a quick paragraph. The company crossed this hill and it was very challenging. In a video game, that has to be a 20-minute plus actual level, with systems and a gameplay loop and everything involved with it. And like we said, video games are unique in this regard and creates, again, that dissonance that can come into play. While a lot of people celebrated the Tomb Raider reboot of all three games, I really grew to hate that franchise. Because a lot of people were really declaring it amazing due to its story, except the story completely clashes with the gameplay that's in there. Again, Lara Croft in cutscenes is vulnerable and suffering from PTSD from all of her recent experiences and unsure of herself. In the gameplay, she runs around head-shooting various guys, jumping off cliffs to impale people with that climbing hook of hers, and one section basically goes on a 5 to 10 minute long killing spree, yelling while shooting a grenade launcher at everybody. And like we said, for a lot of video games, especially again, those that don't focus on storytelling, this kind of discussion doesn't really matter. With the Mario franchise, again, we don't really care about the exact politics of the Mushroom Kingdom. We know Princess Peach has been kidnapped, Bowser is going to be pretty much 100% of the time the bad guy involved, and Mario has to go save her, doing all manner of platforming antics. But as games have been trying to become more serious and, again, trying to elevate the medium, this clash is becoming more and more apparent. And again, it raises this question as to, is there a solution to it? And does that solution in a way hurt the game itself? Because there are other examples of this. One of the more interesting ones is, of course, from BioShock. BioShock, of course, features the Vita Chambers. Magical chambers that exist within the world Rapture that will 100% bring you back to life every time you die. Now, the game tries to write it off by saying only those that the main bad guy, who I can't believe I'm forgetting his name right now, maybe it will come to me as I'm describing it. There it is. Just as I said, Andrew Ryan would allow. But again, it's these kinds of very weird issues. And again, we just certainly get into nitpicky territories with a lot of these titles that tend to hurt the story they're trying to tell. Going back to the JRPG example, there's of course everybody's favorite trope, Aerith dying in Final Fantasy VII, even though we exist in a world that we literally have items that bring people back from the dead. And some people will argue that you can write this off with trying to explain or be more elaborate with the items or the lore. And that is kind of the point. That if you're trying to combine the story of your game with the game mechanics, you have to do more in terms of explaining how all this stuff works. And if you're a long-time follower, then you know that this is definitely leading into topics of emergent gameplay and kind of being more involved or more in-depth level design. And I think we're going to use that as a segue into our next part of this. But first, a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors, and then we're going to talk more about trying to elevate things while keeping that balance. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. As we said in the last part, it is very hard for a lot of games to marry the storytelling and narrative with the mechanics and gameplay loop of their titles. And this takes us into more advanced forms of design. And the example on the screen, of course, is from Prey. Before we talk more about that, a recent example of a game that I think did a very clever job of combining story and gameplay would be Supergiant Games' Hades. Now, Hades is a roguelike, and roguelikes are very hard, I feel, in order to try and have their cake and eat it too in terms of storytelling and gameplay. How do you tell a deeply personal story when your main character is essentially immortal? And every time you die, you come back and you repeat the process again and again. Hades kind of gets around that by the very fact that it takes place with Greek gods. You are the son of Hades, so you're immortal. And what that means, of course, is instead of the narrative, weight on the fact that what if the player dies, it's more about the main character being stuck in, Tartarus. And it's a very, again, clever way of taking the mechanics of a replayable roguelike and building more of a story around it. It's more about the people that the main character encounters and their interactions with him, rather than, again, about what if I die this time. Now, we've seen other titles go for, again, more the passive storytelling. Games such as Dead Cells, or, of course, everybody's favorite example, the Souls series. And here's another bit of a question for this video. Do you think the Souls games kind of cheat when it comes to marrying their storytelling and their game mechanics? Again, all the story, or the majority of the story in a Dark Souls game, is left to the items and the world around it, without ever being really referenced or brought up during the game. Yes, there is a boss character who may have a very important bit to the story, but it's never explained or referenced unless you actively seek it out. And I'm sure I know a few people are going to have some arguments in the comments below with that very question. But with that said, that takes us to our example here again with Prey, and this is the Prey Moon Crash footage. Prey, as with the other titles from Arcane, are really about emergent gameplay or emergent game design. That is, the player is free to explore this world and make use of its mechanics in a way that can lead to surprising results that the designers may not have originally intended. And Arcane is definitely one of the masters when it comes to this idea of merging story and gameplay. Now, what they've done in the past with the Dishonored series is really give the player freedom of choice. You are a badass assassin in the Dishonored games, and it's up to you to decide how you proceed. And the world around you will change and grow accordingly. Killing people or not choosing to kill them can lead to long-term repercussions that the game will reference. And it can be very hard for these kinds of games to know just how far you want to go with it. Because if you say you kill a character and you lose out on all that functionality, that can certainly come back to hurt a player who wasn't prepared for it. As we've seen with some of the older Demon Souls example, where you can accidentally kill the shopkeeper or the blacksmith and you lose the ability to upgrade your weapons. Although I'm sure somebody must have done like a no upgrade run by now. But when we're trying to combine storytelling and gameplay, you have to have that weight in terms of what the player is doing in relation to the story. And again, for a lot of games that have failed along these lines, the gameplay is just utterly divorced from what's going on in the story. Hence all the ludonarrative dissonance examples that I brought up in the first part. That it doesn't matter what you do during the gameplay when the story just moves forward on its own in the cutscenes. And again, when you're trying to tell very personal stories, it can be hard to kind of square that circle of also dealing with the power fantasy or the ARPG loop. Diablo is, of course, another example of this, and how the story, no matter how serious the writers want to make it, just kind of devolves and goes behind the scenes to the ever-growing allure of the ARPG power loop. And again, the story kind of loses its impact the umpteenth time when a character is talking about how they're going to be unstoppable, and your overpowered gear and build will two-shot them. because we've seen that happen before. And this is something that I think the game industry is going to be still trying to answer in this decade. Like I said earlier, there have been games that have tried to tell more emotionally driven stories, and I know everybody's waiting for, of course, The Last of Us 2, which I think is coming out very soon. But one other question that I want to ask: games that try to tell a story that's emotional, but again, it is completely divorced from the gameplay, does that emotional side resonate with you? Another big example of this is, of course, Celeste, that tries again to tell a very deeply personal story about depression and dealing with anxiety, but it comes at the end of brutally difficult Kaizo level sections. Now, getting back to Prey for a minute, the reason why this footage is up is that, again, Arcane does a really great job of trying to build the story and the lore into what options the player has. With what we have here with Prey, that this is a world where you have crazy psychic powers, because there's the whole lore of the Typhon, and getting the again, I forget some of these terms. It's been a while since I played this game, but getting the injections into your eyes that give you those abilities. Again, similar to the plasmids or tonics in Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite. Again, the game rationalizes or explains these crazy concepts by building it into the lore of the world itself, so that there is weight and there is that connection between the story and the gameplay, and that in the end it does matter to the player. Now with Prey, they go as far as giving you that choice between how far do you want to mutate yourself with the Typhon material. And there is the gameplay repercussion of that by the fact that if you go too far, the automated defenses of the world will go after you, thinking that you're an alien. And like we've been saying, trying to figure out how to make all this stuff work is incredibly difficult to do. And when it doesn't work, it can lead to your game just being very lesser or not really holding up as well as you would like. Oh, there is the Neuromods. Thank you for that game footage there. Another really big example, then we begin to wrap things up, is from Infamous 1. This was the third-person open world game by Sucker Punch that dealt with the idea of you deciding whether it be a good or being a superhero or a supervillain. And one of the most annoying and frustrating parts of that game came with a choice. So the player had to decide between saving the woman he loves or saving scientists who could help with the cure of what's going on. And what ended up happening is that no matter what choice you made, the girlfriend was always going to die. Because if you try to save her, you would discover that the girl was just a decoy and the scientist would die and people would hate you. But if you go the other way and save the scientist, then it was actually your girlfriend. And the kind of common point about when we have these moments of dissonance is that when you tell the player that they are able to affect the story or that the story is a major part of the gameplay, but it turns out to be a complete lie. That the story is really just what the developers are trying to tell, and the gameplay is just secondary or maybe sometimes third to the overall experience. So with that said, for those of you watching this, can you think of games other than the ones that we've mentioned where the story and the gameplay really did work as a combined effort? And let me know what you think about those titles in the comments below. As for my final point, as the game industry has been trying to evolve the medium, the story and gameplay connections have been one of the last things that still need some work on. And again, we're only really talking about games that are trying to do more with its storytelling. Like we said earlier, nobody complains about the lack of storytelling or should complain about the lack of story in a Mario game, because that's not really the focus. The same goes for modern retro games that are aimed at like the 8-bit, 16-bit design. But if you're trying to tell me that your story is very serious, you're trying to be mature with it, and the rest of the gameplay is just me running around doing combo multiplier kills and slow-mo headshots, then you are not really, you're kind of not, you don't have a leg to stand on, I guess. It will be very fascinating, however, to see where things go this decade. Because as we've said, this push for greater storytelling really didn't start to occur until probably like the near the beginning of last decade, and then really taking hold by the middle of it. Again, with recent examples such as Disco Elysium will show. And I'm curious for what you guys, or what everyone thinks. Where do you think the next big, I guess, storytelling game mechanic trend is going to come from? And what would you like to see in terms of making the story really resonate with the game mechanics, not just the player? With that said, thanks for watching this video. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. As always, check out the Discord and Patreon link down below, and have a good rest of your night. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below, where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.